Claire's day began like any other, steeped in routine that had become second nature over the years. She woke up at dawn, the light filtering softly through the curtains as she stretched in the comfort of her bed. The air smelled of the fresh coffee Gary always brewed before she even stirred, a small ritual he had maintained since the early days of their marriage. She dressed in silence, her mind distant as she mentally checked off her to-do list for the day. Breakfast was the usual fare: eggs, toast, and a slice of fruit. Simple, but enough to start the day. As she set the plates on the table, Gary appeared in the doorway, his tie slightly askew, a soft smile tugging at his lips. He kissed her cheek, lingering a little longer than usual. "Happy anniversary, honey," he murmured, his voice filled with the kind of warmth that had once made her heart skip a beat. "Happy anniversary," Claire echoed, her tone lighter, almost automatic. She forced a smile, but her thoughts were already drifting elsewhere. Gary pulled out a chair and sat down, oblivious to the storm brewing inside his wife. He talked about his plans for the day, the dinner reservation he had made at Le Petit Bistro, and how he couldn't wait to see her in the new dress he'd bought. Claire nodded along, responding with the appropriate level of enthusiasm, but her mind was already on Jake. Jake had joined her firm a year ago, bringing with him a presence that was impossible to ignore. He was charming, confident, and flirtatious, a stark contrast to the steady, reliable man. At first, it was just harmless banter, an innocent distraction from the monotony of her workday. But over time, the flirting became more intense, the touches more deliberate. Claire found herself drawn to Jake in ways she hadn't felt in years, and it terrified her how quickly she fell into the thrill of it all. As she cleared the breakfast dishes, Claire's phone buzzed with a message from Jake. "Can't wait to see you tonight. My place at 7? She quickly glanced over her shoulder to make sure Gary wasn't watching before typing a quick response. "See you then?" Gary was gathering his things, preparing to leave for the office. He paused at the door, turning back to look at her with a fond expression. "Don't work too hard today, okay? I want you all to myself tonight," he said with a grin. "I won't," Claire promised, forcing another smile. He kissed her again, this time on the lips, a gesture that once would have left her glowing. Now, it only deepened the guilt gnawing at her insides. After Gary left, the house fell silent. Claire stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the spot where he had been just moments before. She knew what she was about to do was wrong, deep down. She knew it was a betrayal of everything they had built together over the past 26 years. But the pull towards Jake was too strong, a magnetic force that she couldn't resist. Around noon, the guilt became too much. She picked up her phone and texted Gary, typing out a lie that came too easily. "Hey love, something urgent came up at work. I might be a bit late for dinner. Don't wait up for me if it gets too late. I'll make it up to you, I promise." His response came almost immediately. "No worries, sweetheart. We'll celebrate whenever you get home. Love you." The sincerity in his words cut through her like a knife. For a brief moment, Claire considered canceling on Jake, going through with the dinner Gary had so carefully planned. But the thought of spending the night in the predictable comfort of their marriage, the same routine that had come to suffocate her, made her feel trapped. As the clock inched closer to 5, Claire slipped into the dress Gary had chosen for her. It was a beautiful piece, elegant and understated, something that would have made her feel special under different circumstances. But tonight, it felt like a costume, a disguise for the role she was about to play. She looked at herself in the mirror, taking in the image of a woman who was about to make a choice that could shatter everything. The reflection stared back at her, eyes wide with a mixture of anticipation and dread. With one last look around the house, Claire grabbed her purse and car keys and headed out the door, not towards the restaurant where her husband was eagerly waiting, but to Jake's apartment, where a different kind of thrill awaited her. And as she drove away, the guilt that had been gnawing at her slowly faded, replaced by the intoxicating rush of anticipation. For just one night, she convinced herself she could have it all. As Claire drove to Jake's apartment, the excitement building inside her was almost unbearable. The city lights blurred by, her thoughts racing faster than the traffic. She kept telling herself that this was just one night, a single night of indulgence, of stepping outside the bounds of her life. The rational part of her mind, the one that usually kept her grounded, was drowned out by the intoxicating thrill of what she was about to do. When she arrived, Jake was waiting for her at the door, a bottle of wine in hand and a mischievous grin playing on his lips. "You look stunning," he said, his eyes raking over her as he pulled her inside. Claire felt a flush of warmth at his words, the kind of compliment that had become rare in her marriage. Inside, the apartment was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of candles and something else, something musky and intoxicating that made her head spin. Jake poured them each a glass of the expensive red wine, a luxury that Claire seldom indulged in. As they clinked glasses, she couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on hers, the unspoken promise of the night ahead hanging between them. They started with small talk, easing into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Jake had a way of making her laugh, his humor sharp and unfiltered. They reminisced about work, shared stories about their colleagues, and joked about the absurdity of office politics. It felt easy, effortless, the kind of conversation that had been missing from her life for so long. The wine flowed freely, loosening the last of Claire's inhibitions. They moved from the kitchen to the living room, where Jake put on some music, something upbeat and carefree that made her feel young again. He took her hand, pulling her into a dance that was more about laughter than grace. They twirled around the room, stumbling over each other's feet, collapsing onto the couch in fits of giggles. For a moment, Claire forgot about everything else. She wasn't a wife, a mother, or an employee. She was just a woman, caught up in the heady rush of a night that felt like a dream. Jake's hands on her waist, his breath against her ear. It all felt so thrillingly new and yet comfortably familiar. As the night wore on, the playful teasing between them turned into something deeper, more intense. The looks they exchanged became charged with unspoken desire, the touches lingering longer, more deliberate. When Jake leaned in to kiss her, it wasn't a tentative gesture but a bold declaration. Claire responded in kind, the electricity between them igniting a spark that quickly turned into a blaze. The world outside Jake's apartment ceased to exist. They were lost in each other, the rest of the night a blur of heated kisses and tangled limbs. Claire felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, every nerve ending on fire, every sensation heightened by the forbidden nature of their tryst. Jake was everything Gary wasn't, spontaneous, adventurous, and a little bit dangerous. With him, there were no expectations, no obligations, just pure, unfiltered desire. Claire let herself get swept away, her body responding to every touch, every whisper, as if she had been starved for this kind of attention for far too long. They moved from the couch to the bedroom, shedding their clothes and any remaining doubts along the way. In the dim light, with the city glowing faintly outside the windows, they found themselves entwined in the sheets, the world outside a distant memory. For a while, there was no past, no future, only the present, only this. In the aftermath, as they lay side by side, their breathing still heavy, Claire felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Satisfaction, certainly, but also a creeping sense of unease. She pushed it down, reminding herself that this was just a momentary escape. She could compartmentalize this, tuck it away in a corner of her mind, and go back to her life with Gary as if nothing had happened. But deep down, she knew better. The line had been crossed, the boundaries blurred. Claire tried to convince herself that it was just a fling, that she could walk away from this unscathed. But as she looked over at Jake, still flushed from their encounter, a part of her knew that nothing would ever be the same again. For now, though, she chose to stay in the moment, savoring the fleeting sense of freedom and exhilaration. Tomorrow could wait. Tonight, she was someone else, someone who lived for the thrill of the moment. Consequences be damned. The night had slipped by in a haze of passion and laughter, the hours blending together until the world outside seemed to disappear entirely. It was well past midnight when Claire finally thought to check her phone. She reached over to the nightstand, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of her screen. The moment she saw the notifications, a cold dread settled in the pit of her stomach. There were several missed calls from Gary, each one time-stamped later and later into the evening. Her heart began to race, 1,000 thoughts swirling in her mind as she opened the first text message. "You deserve each other. Enjoy?" She paused, her breath hitching as she read the next line. "But guess what? You're now a homeless bitch. I'm gonna sleep with your sister." Claire's hands trembled, the phone nearly slipping from her grasp. She felt a wave of nausea rise within her, a sickening realization that everything had just come crashing down. The final blow came in the form of an image, a picture of their wedding rings discarded in a trash can, a brutal symbol of the life she had just destroyed. How had he found out? What had he done? And what in God's name did he mean by homeless? The questions pummeled her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Jake stirred beside her, mumbling something as he shifted under the covers. Claire didn't even register what he said. Her entire focus was on the disaster that was unfolding. She had to get out. She had to figure out what was happening. She threw the covers off, her movements frantic as she scrambled to get dressed. Her clothes were scattered across the floor, remnants of the night she now wished she could erase. As she pulled on her dress, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, disheveled, panicked, a far cry from the confident woman who had walked through Jake's door only hours before. Jake sat up, blinking in confusion. "Claire? What's going on?" he asked, his voice groggy with sleep. I have to go," she stammered, her mind too chaotic to form a coherent explanation. I have to leave." Jake frowned, clearly sensing that something was wrong. But Claire didn't wait for him to press further. She grabbed her purse and phone, barely sparing him a glance as she bolted for the door. The sound of the door slamming behind her echoed in her ears as she rushed down the stairs and out into the cool night air. Her car was parked a few blocks away, the walk seeming to stretch on forever as her thoughts spiraled out of control. What had Gary done? The thought of him sleeping with her sister was too horrifying to contemplate, but it was the word homeless that gnawed at her most. Had he kicked her out? Was there even a home to go back to? Claire's hands shook as she fumbled with her keys, finally managing to unlock the car. She slid into the driver's seat, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The silence of the car was deafening, broken only by the erratic beat of her heart. As she drove through the empty streets, her mind raced to piece together what had happened. Had Gary been suspicious? Had someone seen her with Jake and told him? The possibilities were endless, each one more terrifying than the last. Her phone buzzed again, startling her out of her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen, half expecting another venomous message from Gary. But it was just a notification from her sister, Nancy, inviting her to lunch the next day. Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of it. How could her sister have any idea that their world was on the brink of imploding? The drive home felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. As she pulled into her driveway, the sight that greeted her was both familiar and alien. The house stood in the darkness, silent and foreboding, a stark contrast to the warmth it had once held. She sat in the car for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she tried to summon the courage to face whatever awaited her inside. The night with Jake, the thrill, the passion, it all felt like a distant memory, eclipsed by the reality she now had to confront. With a deep breath, Claire stepped out of the car, the cool air biting at her skin as she approached the front door. She reached for the handle, her heart pounding in her chest, bracing herself for the nightmare that was about to unfold. As Claire turned into the driveway, the stillness of the night seemed unnaturally heavy. The house loomed ahead, a silhouette in the darkness that no longer felt like home. The absence of Gary's car was the first unsettling sign that something was terribly wrong, but she tried to push the creeping dread aside. Perhaps he was out cooling off, trying to collect his thoughts after discovering her betrayal. But the hollow ache in her chest told her otherwise. She fumbled with the keys, her fingers shaking as she struggled to fit the right one into the lock. The door swung open with a low creak, and she stepped inside, immediately engulfed by an eerie silence. The familiar warmth of their home had been replaced by a chilling emptiness. Claire reached for the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out, leaving her to navigate the darkness by the pale glow of the moon filtering through the windows. Her foot caught on something as she took a step forward, and she nearly tripped. Bending down, she realized it was a shattered picture frame, the glass fragments scattering across the hardwood floor. She picked it up, holding it to the light. It was a photo from their wedding day, the glass now cracked through the middle, splitting their smiling faces in two. Her heart twisted as she stared at it, the weight of what she had done pressing down on her like a vice. As she moved further into the house, the full extent of Gary's rage became clear. Furniture was upended, cushions slashed open, their stuffing spilling out like entrails. Books and papers were strewn everywhere, the remnants of a life she had once cherished now littered across the floor. It was a war zone, and Claire felt as though she were the casualty. But it was the walls that stopped her in her tracks. What had once been a gallery of memories, family photos, framed art, tokens of a shared life, was now a canvas of fury. Spray-painted words screamed at her from every direction. Liar, cheater 304, and the one that stung the most, betrayal. Her breath hitched as she stumbled through the house, each step revealing more destruction. The kitchen, where they had shared countless meals, was a disaster. Cabinets hung open, their contents shattered on the floor. The refrigerator door was ajar, food spoiling in the darkness. The dining table, the centerpiece of their home, was overturned, its legs broken. The living room, where they had once curled up together to watch movies, was unrecognizable. The TV was smashed, the couch slashed to ribbons. Even the fireplace, once a place of warmth, was cold and desecrated. The ashes from their last fire scattered across the floor. It wasn't until she reached the bedroom that the full gravity of Gary's actions hit her. The bed, where they had spent countless nights side by side, was stripped bare, the mattress leaning against the wall as if it had been tossed aside in a fit of rage. In the center of the room, where their bed once lay, was a single envelope, stark against the emptiness. Claire's hands shook as she picked it up, dread coiling in her stomach. She tore open the envelope, pulling out a piece of paper with Gary's familiar handwriting scrawled across it. I hope it was worth it. The words felt like a knife twisting in her gut. She continued reading, her vision blurring with tears. Everything we built together is gone. Don't bother trying to find me. By the time you read this, I'll be long gone. Enjoy your new life. Oh, and say hi to your sister for me. The note slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor. Claire collapsed beside it, her legs giving out as the weight of Gary's revenge crushed her. She had never imagined he was capable of something like this. The man she had taken for granted, the man she had deceived, had turned her world upside down in the most brutal way possible. She looked around the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Everything she had known, everything she had thought was safe and certain, was gone. Gary had torn through their life together like a hurricane, leaving nothing but devastation in his wake. The realization that she had brought this upon herself was almost too much to bear. Sobs racked her body as she curled up on the cold, hard floor. The life she had once known was in ruins, and all she could do was weep for what she had lost, for what she had destroyed. The days following Gary's brutal revenge were a blur of panic and desperation for Claire. She barely slept, her mind consumed with fear and regret. Every morning she woke up hoping it had all been a nightmare, but the devastation in her once cozy home was a harsh reminder that her world had crumbled. She tried frantically to reach Gary, but each attempt only deepened her despair. His phone number, once a lifeline, was now disconnected, and his social media profiles had vanished as if he had never existed. She called his friends, his colleagues, even their closest family members, but their responses were either curt or evasive. No one knew where Gary was, or if they did, they weren't about to tell her. The pity in their voices was unmistakable, a clear indication that word of her affair had spread like wildfire. Claire could feel the judgment in every conversation, the unspoken condemnation that followed her everywhere she went. It wasn't until she tried to access their bank accounts that the full extent of her situation became horrifyingly clear. The accounts were empty, completely drained. Down to the last cent, panic set in as she rifled through paperwork, desperately searching for an explanation. That's when she found the documents. Gary had transferred ownership of the house to himself weeks before, then sold it without her knowledge. Claire was left with nothing, no money, no home, and no way to fight back. The reality of her situation hit her like a freight train. She was homeless, penniless, and utterly alone. The shame of her actions weighed heavily on her, a constant presence that clung to her like a shadow. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her, as if the entire world knew of her betrayal. Her once orderly life had unraveled into chaos, and all she could do was watch as everything she had known slipped through her fingers. As the days turned into weeks, Claire pieced together how Gary had orchestrated his revenge. He had been suspicious for some time, quietly observing her behavior, noting the late nights at work and the increasing distance between them. Eventually, his suspicions had led him to hire a private investigator, someone who had followed her, taken photos, and compiled enough evidence to confirm his worst fears. The knowledge that Gary had known about her affair, had planned his retaliation so meticulously, left Claire feeling hollow. The man she had underestimated, the one she had thought would always be there, had dismantled her life with surgical precision. She had underestimated him, and now she was paying the price. The final blow came a few weeks later, delivered in the form of a plain white envelope that arrived in the mail. At first, Claire thought it might be another bill, another reminder of her now precarious situation. But when she opened it, her blood ran cold. It was an invitation, simple, elegant, and utterly devastating. The invitation was from her sister, Nancy, inviting her to a wedding. The groom's name was Gary. Claire stared at the invitation, her hands shaking so violently she could barely keep hold of it. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes, the words on the paper swimming in and out of focus. She read it again, hoping that somehow she had misunderstood, that her eyes were playing tricks on her. But the name was there, clear as day. Gary, her husband, or rather, her ex-husband. She sank into a chair, the weight of what she had done crushing her from all sides. It wasn't just her marriage that was gone. Gary had found a way to twist the knife even further, to strike at the very heart of her family. The thought of him with her sister, the betrayal from both sides, was more than she could bear. In the days that followed, Claire tried to find the strength to fight back, to salvage some part of her life. She consulted lawyers, but the divorce papers that had arrived shortly after the incident left her with no recourse. Gary had been thorough, ensuring that she was left with nothing. When she had tried to reach out to him, begging for forgiveness, for some semblance of mercy, he had only responded through his lawyer. The divorce was final, and there would be no reconciliation. The world Claire had known was gone, replaced by a cold, unrelenting reality. As the wedding date approached, she found herself sinking deeper into despair, unable to escape the consequences of her actions. Gary's revenge had been total, leaving her with nothing but the bitter taste of regret and the shattered remnants of a life she had once taken for granted. The invitation sat on her kitchen table, a constant reminder of the life she had lost. And as the days slipped by, Claire realized that she was truly alone, left to grapple with the choices that had led her to this point. The day of the wedding dawned with a gray, oppressive sky that seemed to mirror Claire's mood. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection as she tried to summon the courage to face what lay ahead. Her hands trembled as she applied makeup, each stroke of the brush a futile attempt to mask the turmoil churning inside her. The dress she wore, a simple black sheath, was the only thing that seemed appropriate, a stark contrast to the joyous occasion she was about to witness. As she made the drive to the venue, Claire's thoughts were a tangled mess of regret and desperation. Nancy and Gary's relationship had always been close, but she had never imagined it would culminate in this ultimate betrayal. The invitation, with its elegant script and cruel implications, had felt like the final nail in the coffin of her old life. But a part of her, the part that still clung to some shred of hope, believed that if she could just see Gary, speak to him, she could somehow make things right. The wedding was held in a quaint chapel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place she and Gary might have chosen themselves in another life. As Claire stepped out of her car and approached the entrance, she felt eyes on her, sharp, judging eyes that seemed to pierce through her. It was as if everyone knew who she was, what she had done, and they all silently condemned her for it. Inside, the atmosphere was festive, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Claire's heart. She could feel the disdain radiating from every corner, a palpable tension that made her want to turn and run. But she didn't. She couldn't. Claire's heart sank as she caught sight of her sister, Nancy, standing at the front of the chapel. Dressed in a simple but elegant white gown, Nancy looked radiant, her face glowing with happiness. Claire couldn't help but notice the subtle similarities between the dress Nancy wore now and the one she had worn on her own wedding day, a small, bitter reminder of the life that was no longer hers. Nancy's eyes swept over the crowd, meeting Claire's briefly before moving on as if she were just another face in the crowd. There was no warmth, no acknowledgement of the bond they once shared. The cold indifference in Nancy's gaze cut deeper than any words could. It was clear that whatever relationship they had once had was now as broken as Claire's marriage. Gary stood beside Nancy, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. When his eyes locked with Claire's, there was no trace of the man she had once loved. The warmth and kindness that had defined him were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating satisfaction. He had one, and they both knew it. He didn't need to say a word. The look in his eyes was enough to convey the depth of his victory. Claire was no longer the woman he loved, but the enemy he had vanquished. The ceremony began, and Claire found herself sitting in the back row, isolated from the rest of the guests. The words of the officiant washed over her like a distant echo, drowned out by the roar of her own thoughts. She watched as Gary and Nancy exchanged vows, their voices steady, filled with the conviction of a future together. Each word was a reminder of what she had lost, what she had thrown away. As the couple exchanged rings, Claire's vision blurred with tears. The gold bands gleamed in the candlelight, a cruel mockery of the ones that had been discarded in the trash. This was supposed to be her life, her marriage, her happiness. But it was all gone now, swept away by the tidal wave of her own mistakes. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, the chapel erupted in applause, the sound crashing over Claire like a wave. She remained seated, her hands clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. The pain was a welcome distraction from the emptiness that threatened to consume her. As Gary and Nancy kissed, sealing their union, Claire felt the last vestiges of her hope slip away. The life she had known was truly over, and there was no going back. All that remained was the bitter aftertaste of regret and the knowledge that she had only herself to blame. When the ceremony ended and the guests began to file out of the chapel, Claire remained seated, her eyes fixed on the floor. She couldn't bring herself to move, to face the reality waiting outside those doors. She had come here hoping for a chance to make things right, but all she found was the cold, hard truth. Gary had moved on, and he had done so with the one person she had never expected to betray her. Eventually, she stood, her legs feeling like lead as she made her way to the exit. The celebration continued around her, but it felt like a world apart, a place where she no longer belonged. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Claire realized that she was truly alone. The world she had once known was gone, replaced by a harsh, unforgiving reality. And as she walked away from the chapel, she knew that she could never return to the life she had lost. The months after the wedding were some of the hardest of Claire's life. Each day felt like an uphill battle as she tried to navigate the wreckage of the life she had once known. With nowhere else to turn, she found herself in a small, cramped apartment on the edge of town. It was a far cry from the spacious home she had shared with Gary, but it was all she could afford after he had taken everything. The walls were thin, the furniture was sparse, and the loneliness was suffocating. Claire threw herself into her work, taking on extra shifts and freelance projects to make ends meet. The routine was grueling, but it kept her mind occupied, numbing the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. The affair with Jake, which had once been an exhilarating escape, quickly lost its appeal. Without the thrill of secrecy, their connection faded, leaving Claire feeling even more isolated. Jake stopped calling, and Claire didn't bother to reach out. Their relationship had been built on lies and deceit, and without that foundation, there was nothing left to salvage. As Claire struggled to rebuild her life, Gary and Nancy's world seemed to flourish effortlessly. Social media became a double-edged sword, a painful reminder of the happiness she had lost and the life she had inadvertently created for them. She couldn't help but scroll through their posts, each one a dagger to her heart. There were photos of exotic vacations, their new house, and, eventually, the announcement that Nancy was pregnant. Gary's smile in those pictures was wide and genuine, a stark contrast to the last time Claire had seen him. The knowledge that Gary was thriving in his new life, while she was barely scraping by, filled Claire with a toxic mix of bitterness and regret. But there was nothing she could do. The life she had known was gone, and no amount of wishing could bring it back.